Welcome everyone. I think I know, looking at the list of participants, I think I know all of you. I won't bother introducing myself, but welcome back to the 2024-2025 season for the Grand River chapter. This is our first meeting of the season, and we're thrilled to have with us Dr. Robert Stark. Rob Stark is a new hire in the anthropology department at UW, so new colleague of mine. He received his PhD in anthropology from McMaster University in 2017, and he is a biological archaeologist with research interests in questions of health and population dynamics, diet, mobility in the ancient world. He's worked in various regions, including here in Ontario, I think, Rob, is that right?
That's correct. Not
Okay.
significantly in a bioarchaeology capacity, but yeah,
Yeah,
in
right.
various other
I thought so.
primarily
So
Sudan work. Yeah,
he's worked here in
yeah,
Ontario,
yes, definitely.
but principally in Sudan. That's where his much of his research has taken place within a medieval context there, which we'll be hearing about tonight. He teaches courses for us in biological anthropology, not surprisingly, including things like human osteology, paleopathology, and advanced topics in biological and forensic anthropology. And are you teaching a grad course this year, Rob? I can't remember.
No, I'm not teaching a
Okay.
grad course this
There
year.
was
No,
talk of that at one point. Uh,
maybe next year.
maybe next year.
Stay tuned.
So yeah, so so that's a little bit about Dr. Stark, and the title for his paper, his lecture this evening is "Living and Dying at Medieval Tungul." Have I got that right? Old
Yeah,
Dongola
yep,
in the Sudan.
that's me.
You can take it away, Rob. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Chris. And I will endeavor to make the technology work on my end. It is okay. The classic question: is it okay on your end? Is this working? Yes.
Everything
Oh,
looks great, Rob.
okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm always paranoid because I can't see anyone. So, anyways, as Chris very kindly said, tonight I will talk about living and dying at medieval Tungul, also known as Old Dongola, in what is today Sudan, as you can see pictured in the background here. So, of course, before we begin, we acknowledge that we are present and working within and working on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, also known as the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. The main Waterloo campus of the University of Waterloo, where I find myself this evening in Waterloo, is situated within the Haldimand Tract, which is a tract of land granted to the Six Nations that comprises 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River from its source in Dundalk Township to its mouth at Lake Erie. So thank you very much for having me here this evening. Alas, I will be taking us a little further than Ontario to Sudan, and I must advise that this presentation shows images of human skeletal remains, so if that is not of interest to you, please tune out now. And I also wanted to note, if it's not something you're already familiar with, that I would like to keep in our thoughts the people of Sudan who have been amidst a civil war for the last year, and of course we all very much hope for this to end and for a restoration of peace in Sudan. And so with that said, I'll move now to the site of Tungul, which is located in Sudan today. So we're talking here about the medieval time period in Sudan. So we're talking mostly from the 6th century into about roughly the 14th century CE. And during this time, a distinct feature is the emergence of three kingdoms, so-called Nobadia, Makuria, and Alodia or Alwa. You can see on the map on the right-hand side here where these are Nobadia in the north, Makuria, which will be the prime topic area of our talk tonight, and Alwa in the south. So Old Dongola was the capital of the kingdom of Makuria, and it's located between the third and fourth cataracts along the Nile. So it's directly on the banks of the Nile, and it was known in Greek and Coptic as Temeklios and in Nubian as Tungul. And of course, the question, it's called Old Dongola today because the capital of the territory that it's in is Dongola. So it's not called New Dongola, but everyone calls this site Old Dongola to distinguish it. They're about an hour apart. And so a key feature of this time period in this region is the conversion to Christianity in the late 6th century into the 7th century. And as a function of this, there's also the development of a large number of monasteries, including 2 thus far identified at the site I'll speak about tonight. So this becomes a prime sociocultural and political ethos of the region at this time. And so, there are numerous monasteries, including several at Old Dongola and another out in the desert that I'd worked at previously called Ghazali. We know very little about the physical remains of many of these monasteries, as so far only a small handful have actually been excavated, but we have attestations of quite a significant number of monasteries. So it was a fairly popular development in the region. We know it was widespread. And so, a little bit about the site of Tungul, Old Dongola. It's the capital of Makuria, as I had mentioned, and a primary center of power, particularly during the 6th to 15th century CE. So the site itself sort of develops in the 5th century. It transitions into this capital in the 6th century, and it remains occupied as a settlement today. So the site itself that's pictured in this map is not directly occupied, but you can see here, hopefully on this map, where it says abandoned village, is a not so long ago occupied area, and the village now is to the north of this image that continues to be inhabited today. So the site has been, for all intents and purposes, in use in all reality since about the 5th century CE. And most notably at the site, there's a densely occupied citadel area. So we have this primary citadel that I've outlined in yellow here. We also have, as previously noted, 2 monasteries, so-called Com D and Com H, just located by their archaeological site reference areas. There's some debate as to the names of them, but I won't address that this evening. There's a very extensive Christian cemetery, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And there are also other aspects of the site. A settlement area, there's numerous churches that have been identified, pottery kilns for the production of pottery, as well as an extensive Muslim cemetery that was used, aspects of which continue to be used today, but it's also been used earlier in time in the 16th century, this time period. But this is not the subject of any excavation, nor will it be the subject of excavation. But you can see here the sort of development of the landscape at this site. And so the site excavations have been undergoing since 1964. The project was initiated in 1964 by Kazimierz Michałowski and Najmuddin Sharif. Subsequently, it was directed by, I've put the abbreviation here, but PCMA-UW stands for the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology of the University of Warsaw. So it's a Polish directed project in collaboration with the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums of Sudan, so-called NCAM. And so following the work of Michałowski and Najmuddin Sharif, the site was directed by Stefan Jakobielski, Włodzimierz Godlewski, and currently, up until today, by Arturo Buski. So as you can imagine, from a site of this size, since 1964, a significant amount of work has been done, but it's a very, very large footprint. It's several hectares in size. So there remains a lot to be done. In terms of the bioarchaeology side, which I'll talk about primarily tonight, initial work was undertaken in the 70s and 80s by Tadeusz Jerzy-Kryj-Rogalski and Elżbieta Prominska. And I put here, or I use here rather, the term serendipitous, as the work at this time was not so much bioarchaeologically driven in the sense of setting up a project and seeking to address things, but rather a lot of work in this era was undertaken as a consequence of the identification of burials during ongoing excavations. So this is to say in several churches, in various deposition contexts in the settlement, so sort of as needed, let's say. In the 90s, a substantial survey is undertaken of the Christian cemetery, as you can see again pictured in the map by Bogdan Żurawski. No actual skeletons are excavated or analyzed at this time, but this contributes a lot to our knowledge of the site in terms of documentation of superficial burial structures, the dynamics of different burial spaces. And then subsequently, beginning in the 2000s, Robert Mahler worked on the monastery on Comage and the sanctuary of Anna, Anna being the proposed first saint known by name in Nubia. And then comes myself. From 2019 into today, I've been working primarily in the Christian cemetery, as well as other serendipitous contexts, we might say, some burials that have come to light during excavation on the citadel, as well as some ongoing analyses with Robert Mahler in the Comage Monastery. And so this is what I'll talk a little bit more about this evening. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some radiocarbon dating data that we have, another burial, so-called Grave 2, that'll become clear in a moment, as well as the crypts 1 to 3 on Comage, a little bit about diet and a little bit about mobility. So sort of a mixed bag and a state of affairs of what's going on bioarchaeologically at Old Dongola today. And so one of the aspects that we've been trying to address in excavations in the Christian cemetery, and so this is a little south maybe the mouse works. Anyways, a little bit in the southern southern end of the Christian cemetery, close to the adjacent Muslim cemetery. And I point this out specifically as one of the aspects that we're trying to investigate, as we're not going to be conducting excavations in the Muslim cemetery, is the development of the Christian cemetery. Do these reflect transition zones in the early end, in the late end? Where is the margin of the Christian cemetery? So it's been, to keep flipping back, reconstructed here. We have a general sense of the dimensions of the Christian cemetery, but we don't really know a lot about the margins or the full extent. So we did some magnetometry and ground penetrating radar was undertaken that identified some distinct anomalies. And I should say the Muslim burials and the Christian burials are oriented in different fashions. So we can distinguish the two from one another. And this region suggested that it might be the edge of the Christian cemetery. And so, undertaking a little bit of radiocarbon dating, we've only excavated 5 graves so far. As you can see here, not a whole lot of individuals. Grave 2 had multiple individuals. But from these, we get a relatively early suite of dates. So you can see here in the 95.4% column, these are all quite early. 8th century, 6th century, 7th century, to go out of order a bit. But what we're seeing here is not really necessarily conclusive of the margin, though this is at the edge of the cemetery, but it's suggesting that this area of the large Christian cemetery was perhaps used at the earlier phase as opposed to the later phase. So this may reflect earlier burials in this area. I know, yes, I put this note here. ODB, if you wondered, is just the recording short form for Old Dongola burial. So they're sequenced according to their excavation phase. And so this is, as you've all gathered, obviously a very small assemblage of burials that we've excavated and dated. And so it tells us a little bit about this early area of use. But again, it's a massive, massive cemetery. So it's not really so comprehensive as to provide a lot of insight. But nonetheless, this is where the radiocarbon dating of burials stands at present. Radiocarbon dating has also helped to address, or hopefully has helped to address a little bit about this burial. And I bring this up not specifically for the radiocarbon dating, but rather as a point of interest in that most of the burials we have at the site look something like figure D here, a sort of shallow, 1.5 meters about in depth, depression in the bedrock. Sometimes there's adjacent bricks covering the burial, and typically there's one individual interred in these graves. Surprisingly, this burial contained 15 individuals, even though its dimensions are akin to that for other burials where one individual was interred. And so this burial, of course, brought forth a number of questions. Why were there 15 individuals in this one burial that's more suited in size and space for a single individual, particularly as there are several individuals? So again, if we consider here figure D, you can see this sort of semicircular area to the right of the image. And this is a sort of excavated entryway, for lack of a better word. There's a small area demarcating the actual entry area into the grave, which was originally covered by bricks that you can't see here. And so these individuals that you see in the other images, A, C, or A, B, and C, are halfway into this grave and halfway out of this grave. So their legs are within what we would see as the actual grave area, and the top end of their torsos and their skull, of course, is outside in this sort of entryway. And so really this grave suggests some sort of odd event. Odd in the sense of there's not any evidence of secondary burial here. We don't have an instance, or it doesn't appear evident, where one burial is put in, and once that individual is skeletonized, the remains are moved to the side or the back, and a new individual is introduced. Rather, we have 15 individuals in this burial that remain, for all intents and purposes, articulated. And I say for all intents and purposes in that some of the elements have, moved away after decomposition. The hand or the wrist is slightly loose, but nothing that suggests secondary movement of the burials. And again, to have 3 individuals half in and half out suggests that some catastrophic or urgent, some sort of event that necessitated 15 people to be buried very quickly may have occurred. What that could be, I don't know. It's not clear. We don't have any clear evidence from the burials or any sort of documentary evidence from the dating that I'll come to that suggests a catastrophic event. It's just simply, at present, unknown and perhaps never knowable. And so we endeavored to look a little more, right? The question, there's 15 individuals. Well, what does the dating tell us? Maybe we can get at a sense of, okay, the interpretation is that they were reopening the burial and reintroducing or introducing subsequent people as opposed to just one time period. And in an anticlimax, it doesn't really solve that. Radiocarbon dating the ranges of the return dates were, alas, too broad overall to really address this. We have a range of dates for these individuals, but they all sort of overlap. And so ODB 19 here is at the bottom of the grave. So starting at the surface with, I think the number here was 3. There was 2 burials before this. So 7 is closer to the top. 19 is closer to the bottom. And so going from the topmost individual, so ostensibly one of the last individuals interred in this grave, down to the bottom for one of the earliest individuals, we have this range of dates. So at the bottom, we get a date of 655 to 775. And at the top, we get a range of 711 to 953. So it's possible that this grave was utilized over an extended period of time. But alas, one of the challenges here is that the radiocarbon dates are quite wide. So there's also the possibility of an interpretation that the overlapping dates reflect, sort of co-interment period. So it remains somewhat unsatisfying in its ambiguity. But nonetheless, we have some further insight about this atypical grave in terms of its chronology. And so this brings me to a little bit about crypts 1 to 3 on COM-H. And so COM-H, as you can see outlined in yellow here, is part of a northwest annex that abuts the COM-H monastery. So it's not to say that it's within the monastery walls, but it's a building that has been built on to or abutting the COM-H monastery. And it evidently functioned from the 10th to the end of the 13th century CE. And so the reason of interest here is that the interior of the annex is decorated with wall paintings depicting both biblical scenes and members of Nubian society. So this is to say it's, well, quite fancy. It has some very high-end paintings. Some of the paintings include elements like lapis lazuli and very, sort of expensive pigments. It's very, very deluxe. And so it brings forth questions why these crypts 1 to 3 that were originally excavated by Robert Mahler contain an archbishop of Old Dongola. So we don't know specifically who was interred in these crypts. And one of the challenges in general with medieval Nubia is that the written record is quite sparse. We have really nothing comparable to what we see in, say, Byzantium or Egypt. We don't have a lot of evidence. So in these crypts, ironically, we have, maybe not ironically, but by coincidence, we have this epitaph of one Archbishop Georgios, who is the archbishop from 1063 to 1113, above crypt 1. This is pictured on the left here. On the right-hand side, we see the interior of this crypt 1, which you can see is covered with these extensive texts. It's been whitewashed and painted on in black ink, and these texts comprise a number of prayers and magical texts. So quite a lot of work. There's multiple individuals interred in this tomb. So one of the questions, or one of the assertions about this burial locale has long been that it's the final resting place of bishops, or of the bishops of Dongola. We know that Dongola served as the see of a bishopric in the region. We also think that bishops or members of the priesthood might have been drawn from the monastery. There's a strong connection with the monastery and then higher roles in the clergy and the church. And so one of the contentions is that this annex served as a burial spot for the bishops in connection with their history as potential monastics. This is unsubstantiated in any direct way, but it's one theory in a sort of broader interpretation. Conversely, though, the remaining 2 crypts, and so you can see on the image on the right here where these 3 are located. So we have crypt 1 isolated by itself, and then through a narrow room, we come into another area with crypts 2 and crypts 3, which are not decorated in the same way. And unfortunately, they don't also have any associated epitaphs. So we don't know anything about the individuals there. We only know from crypt 1 that Georgios was interred there, or therein. And so further evidence, I should say, in terms of burials during the medieval time period in Sudan, we see a almost absolute austerity in burial. So preceding periods, we see pottery vessels interred in graves. We see various aspects of jewelry and personal equipment. With the arrival of Christianity and the transition to the so-called medieval period, we see a real change to austerity. There's no burial goods. Individuals are typically buried in a shroud or perhaps some clothing, but there's really nothing in the graves to tip off one individual from the other in terms of temporality of grave goods or in terms of perhaps social status. Here in crypts 1 to 3, we see some evidence to suggest that they may have been of a higher status and that they're buried with these pectoral crosses. So again, even any singular good is a sign perhaps of some aspect of social difference. Here we see pectoral crosses, which again, Christianity is the dominant religion at the time. So it's not to say they couldn't just be average people, but perhaps, again, this is in connection with their role in the priesthood or as bishops. We also see a number of individuals interred in or with very high-end fabrics. So we have some 12th century Tiraz-style silk textile with gold-coated threads, so materials that are not going to be encountered easily or cheaply. Gold, of course, very expensive. Silk, not from the region, and also very fine, very finicky to produce. And these are dyed textiles. So we have also textile materials that set these individuals apart from the other types of shreds that are typically used, which are pretty plain, tabby weave textiles made out of linen or sometimes cotton, various materials, but nothing decorated like this. So this again suggests some sort of element of difference here. And so one of the questions, again, we wanted to know was, well, how long were the crypts used for? We have multiple individuals in them. 2 of the graves have 7 individuals and 1 has 5. And so we radiocarbon dated these individuals. And we were able to determine that overall, all 3 crypts, that the maximum sort of range was 490 years. And if we look crypt by crypt, crypt 1 was evidently used over a range of 315 years, crypt 2, 280 years, and crypt 3, 485 years. Excuse me. And so these crypts were used over an extended period of time, which again sort of reaffirms their potential importance in the broader Dongola landscape, that individuals kept being interred in this very specific setting, as opposed to in the adjacent vast Christian cemetery or other contexts. But it does not really address who these individuals, who these individuals might have been. Because again, it's somewhat of an uncommon or unexpected area for bishops to be buried, given that often, as with examples at Faris, further north in Sudan, bishops or members of the clergy were often buried in the church. There's a monastery church directly next to this monastery. So it's really an unresolved sort of question as to who these individuals are, but we at least know now the temporality of these burials, when they were in use, and at least one individual that was an archbishop evidently interred therein. So it's quite likely that it reflects maybe more of a mix, some bishops, maybe some church members, and quite possibly maybe some social elite of the site. But again, this is stretching the interpretation to a level of inference that's not really fully substantiated by the data. So we know a lot, but we would love to know more. And so in line with these broader questions about temporality and burial traditions and stuff at the site, we also wanted to know what individuals were eating at the site or during this time. So Tungul is the capital of Makuria, would likely have seen diverse segments of society. Do we see dietary similarity or disparity, right? So alone, it's a large site in general. It's a capital site. It's also well positioned along a number of trade routes. Directly across the Nile River is the Wadi Hawar, that has known connections into Kordofan, into Darfur, travel into the Trans-Saharan Way. It's also, as you know, along the Nile. So there's ample opportunity as a capital, as a prime center in the region, for inter-regional contacts, as well ostensibly for, different populations to be residing there and potentially eating different foods. So we wanted to do a little sort of introductory assessment as to what the diets of these individuals looked like. So we assessed from bone collagen, carbon, delta 13C, and nitrogen, delta 15N. And we examined a range of individuals interred in different contexts. So we examined individuals interred in the Christian cemetery, COM-H outside, which is to say that they are outside but in direct proximity to the monastery, so kind of around the monastery. Crypts 1 to 3 that I just previously spoke about in the Northwest Annex, as well as the proposed Anna from the Sanctuary of Anna, which is directly next to this COM-H monastery. And again, Anna has been identified as this saint, the first saint known by name in Nubia. And again, some rationale here, right? Crypts 1 to 3, we have the inference that these individuals were quite likely social elites. Maybe we don't know confirmatorily that they were all bishops or all priests or all in the church hierarchy, but we're fairly confident that this positioning, this placement, as well as the artifacts in the graves suggest there were some individuals of quite likely elevated social status. So I've used the term social elites here. Outside COM-H, we infer that perhaps these were wealthier individuals who could afford to be buried near the monastery. Perhaps they were monks. So we know the practice of ad sanctos burials is in the region and adjacent regions within the sort of Christian tradition. This is to say the practice of interring individuals in direct proximity to holy sites or buildings associated with the church. So the monastery being a place of the church, there's some argumentation to be made that the burials adjacent to it might reflect individuals who had either the financial means or the social standing or the capacity to be buried in proximity to this holy place as a sort of, proximity being, close to sanctity, like close to a sacred site. So the proximity was a desirable thing, to be closer to these aspects of the faith in death. Anna, again, is the first proposed saint known by name in Nubia, and individuals in the Christian cemetery reflect, reflect an unclear social structure. This is to say that the Christian cemetery is a large cemetery that would have been used by the diverse population of Old Dongola. So we don't know as yet, what sections were used by whom. So we just know that it would have been used by the broader populace of the site. And so this is all to say that we have a diverse assemblage of individuals. And so we sought to look at some of their diet. And so while I won't go into the sort of background of the isotopes, we can look at this chart for a quick second to see how this is going to work, and that the foods we're eating, both in terms of plant matter, C3, C4, are going to plot at different areas on the graph. And depending on the level of protein in the diet, we can see different elevation or different values for delta 15N. So the placement in relation to these values gives us some insight to the types of foods individuals were eating. And I want to stress, if it's an unfamiliar topic or something, we can't really say specifically one variety of food versus the other. We can't say, they were eating sorghum and not millet. That level of refinement's not really possible. They were eating cattle, they were eating steak and not tripe. These sorts of things, we can get a little closer to it. But what I want to say is I'm not going to pinpoint specific foods here. We can use sort of the placement of the data and then interpolate from other known aspects about diet in this region. So we plotted initially a number of values for known products in the area. So from archaeobotanical remains and from zoological remains, we had expected values for C3 plants in the region, as well as C4 plants, as well as various fauna. So you can see cow, herbivorous fish, omnivorous fish, and carnivorous fish. Admittedly, there's a lot of overlap of these values, but I swear they're all there. Goat, sheep, dog. And the dog here is not to suggest that individuals were eating dog, but as many of you are probably well aware, the use of dogs can help as a sort of dietary proxy, with the assumption that dogs were often probably eating some degree of table scraps, let's say, some food that humans were eating, either directly fed table scraps or from the remains of food, right? We've thrown out this, beef shank, and now this dog is eating it. So it provides some aspect of insight to what human diets might have looked like. And this tracks here. And then again, we see all the human values that I'm talking about here. So COMH CRIP3, ANA, outside. And so while I don't expect that you will just look at it and say, oh, okay, that's great. So let's break it down a little bit. So taking this into consideration, what we can say about the diets of the individuals analyzed from Tungul is that their diets primarily comprised a mixed C3, C4 diet. This is not at all surprising. For medieval context in Nubia, a lot of work is substantiated, namely the work of White and Schwartz and White, amongst others. But the idea is pretty strongly put forward in these works first, that seasonal variation may have accounted for as much as 75% of C3 products. So C3 products here of importance being wheat and barley during the winter, and up to 75% C4 products such as sorghum and millet in the summer. And the rationale here is that wheat and barley, C3 plants in this environment, are much more finicky to cultivate. They're harder to cultivate throughout the year, versus products like sorghum and millet are much more hardy and resistant to the often harsh summer environments. It's hot, it's dry, but the cultivation is more adaptable to this environment. And so the argument is that they're eating these different balanced diets throughout the year. And the other argument as to why this proportion might be this way, or why these proportions might be this way, is that the introduction of the Sakya water wheel comes along at this time. So the introduction of additional opportunities for irrigation arguably allowed for extended cultivation capacities of C3 plants. So it allowed for C3 plants to be even further cultivated and consumed in the months where it was possible to grow them before previous time periods. And the evidence for sorghum and millet continue to remain commonly consumed products in the region today. And we have evidence from the past, including at Tungul, of ceramics associated with the cooking of what is known as kisra. So kisra is sort of a sorghum-based pancake. If any of you enjoy Ethiopian food, the closest analogy would be something like injera bread, this sort of flat, spongy sort of bread. And it's cooked on these ceramic vessels that have a flat sort of crepe cooking type surface. So we know from the ceramic evidence there, as well as other archaeobotanical materials, obviously sorghum and millet are known, wheat and barley, these have been identified at various sites, that this is the sort of diet we're looking at in terms of plant-based matter that's being consumed by the individuals we've analyzed. So we don't see any distinct differences across the proposed social segments I've noted in terms of the carbon aspect of their diets. So what can we make of the animal protein part? Oh, well, let's step back for 1 minute because I meant to tell you about this as well, in the sense that archaeobotanical research by Mohammed Nasruddin has demonstrated at Old Dongola a diversity of foodstuffs. So we know that there's a wide variety of plant products that were consumed at the site. This work for archaeobotanical materials was done in relation to a subsequent time period. So the period after the medieval time period at Dongola is called the Funj period. This novel group shows up and occupies the area. And so the archaeobotanical materials for Dongola directly are coming a lot more from the Funj time period, but it's, fair to infer that several of these materials were probably also consumed in the preceding time period. It's not a total supplantation of diet. We also know from the medieval archaeological record at other sites in the area that products like sesame, pulses, such as lupin and lablab beans, peas, lentils, cowpeas, dates, dome. If dome fruit is not familiar, sometimes it's called gingerbread fruit. It grows on a palm tree. It's sort of, I don't want to say a small coconut, but it's sort of the size of a fist, and it tastes sort of like gingerbread. Anyways, onions, grape, quite possibly for wine, though this is less clear, and purslane, known as rijla in Arabic, are also known from other diverse medieval Nubian contexts. So we know of a bunch of plants that would track with the sort of dietary reconstruction we're seeing. And so again, what to say of the nitrogen values of these individuals? So we see, we see a C3, C4 diet for a lot of individuals. Some of these individuals definitely look like they're consuming more C4. But in terms of terrestrial values, we can break it down a little further in terms of what these terrestrial protein values might have been. And so to just go back quickly here for this box. So we can see here that all of these individuals are effectively above the terrestrial fauna or above many of the fauna that we're talking about here. So this suggests that individuals from all contexts considered in this study appear to have included some animal protein products within their diets. Zooarchaeological analyses undertaken at Old Dongola by Marta Ospinska and colleagues identified cattle, sheep-goat, and again, sheep-goat, because it's, let's say, next to impossible to differentiate at a skeletal level, a sheep from a goat is often presented as sort of one portmanteau, sheep-goat. So cattle, sheep-goat, and were evidently the most common products. And during the medieval time period, we also see an uptick in the consumption of pork. Wild game consumption, such as gazelle, which we have attestation of, would also likely have been occurring, but probably to a much less often extent, as these other products, cattle, sheep, goat, would have been kept and widely available. Broader questions exist for avian consumption, as well as aquatic products like fish that I'll come to in a minute. There's just not a lot of clear evidence around how these products were used or if they were consumed, and also about secondary products, butter, milk, yogurt, cheese. There's some suggestion about these, but the evidence thus far is really just is not there as yet. So hopefully we learn more about that in the coming years. And so amongst these individuals, so we're confident that terrestrial proteins are getting into the diets of the people that we're eating, but amongst these individuals, there are several that suggest they were eating other foods as well, that they have these more elevated nitrogen values. And so this is to suggest that aquatic species may have made their way into their diet. So several of the individuals examined, namely I propose these ones here primarily, also appear to have consumed aquatic species, most likely fish, as part of their diet. But maybe this is odd, maybe this is not odd. It's always kind of struck me as an interesting point for further investigation, is that aquatic species consumption in medieval Nubia remains a, in quotes, cryptic topic. So in Wellesby's work in 2002, called The Medieval Kingdoms of Nubia, it's noted that faunal assemblages from medieval contexts suggest aquatic species were a relatively minor component of diet, so not widely consumed. Osipinska, the same individual who had just mentioned working at Dongola, notes the insignificant role of fish in the early Makurite, so Makurian, the same area we're talking about here, diet as a curious matter. So why were they not eating fish? This is sort of the big question, right? But the Nile River is right there. They're directly, literally, you could run the risk of falling into the river if you lost your way at night. So it's directly there. So it's always been intriguing to me and others why we would be seeing such little evidence for the inclusion of aquatic species in the diet. And this is not just from the research I'm showing you. This tracks across other sites as well. And so, of course, a number of questions come forth. Why were they not eating fish? Why would you not be including this in your diet? And so one that's an easy go-to is it could be preservation or ID of species, right? Fish bones are fairly fragile, they're fairly small, they could be easily mistaken, but this argumentation only goes so far, because if you're looking for them, you would probably find them, right? To say maybe you or I, who aren't trained in fish bones, might overlook them, okay. But to say that they'd be always missed at all sites, and some fish vertebrae, particularly larger Nile fish, can be quite large. So why aren't we finding them? We also have attestation in the written record. So from later Arab-speaking chroniclers of the area, El-Makrizi notes fish as a dietary staple in the Batn al-Hajar region of what is today Sudan. El-Idrisi notes the abundance of fish around Old Dongola. So we have people visiting these sites saying, there's a lot of fish in the area. It's possible that fazik was prepared, which is like a salted fermented fish product. Among ostraca from Bawit, so ceramic fragments with writing on them, sort of, letters of a sort. In Egypt, we have 20% discussing the purchase of fish or things to do with getting fish and eating fish. We have zooarchaeological evidence from numerous sites. We have some fishing evident at Soba East, Soba being the capital of Alwa, the kingdom to the south of Makuria. We also have iron fishing hooks, fishing nets. So it's really not super clear why fish do not evidently appear or were not suggested in the literature to have been eaten that often. Some assertions have been made that it might be an association with fish as unclean. We have some evidence from previous time periods suggesting that the consumption of fish maybe is not the cleanest practice and that they should be avoided. But we're sort of at a loggerhead. We have this suggestion that aquatic species were not really consumed. We have some archaeological evidence that it looks like iron fishing hooks, fishing nets, they were dealing with fish. And we have some isotopic data that suggest these individuals were eating aquatic species. But the record remains still fairly opaque around this topic. So this is something I would hope to learn more about in the future. At Old Dongola itself, to make it a little more specific, research at the site identified, again, a fairly small amount, a paltry amount of aquatic species. So 1.4% of fish from 7th century contexts, 0.24% of fish, and 0.48% oyster remains from 13th to 14th century contexts. At Old Dongola, again, Marta Rosa-Pinska and colleagues reported variable amounts of catfish, tilapia, and what are identified as very small fishes. So this is to say, again, from the zooarchaeological record, from contexts at Old Dongola, we have a pretty small amount of evidence to suggest consumption. So again, it piques one's interest. Why not? Hopefully we'll learn more. There are also this cluster of individuals that are intriguing in a different vein, in a similar but different vein, to make an odd statement. But these individuals plot very far to the C4 side of the margin here, and they're also quite elevated in their nitrogen value. So this brings forth, in my mind at least, some additional questions about what was going on with these individuals. The other individuals track in their sort of C3, C4 positioning, the possible consumption of aquatic species, but these individuals really bring forth questions about what they might have been consuming. And if we were in a different context, if we were in a different part of the world, one might think that they were eating an increased or an elevated amount of marine products. You can see in the bottom picture on the right-hand side here, some of the work of Walker and De Niro from 1986 that lays this out, that this transition towards the C3 margin of the axis, as well as this elevation in nitrogen values, tracks with an increased consumption of marine products. But we are nowhere near the sea. So it brings forth questions about what this might suggest. And again, I have no clear answer. It's not impossible that imports could have been coming from distant but not insanely distant Red Sea locales, but it would still be a long way. So, what sort of products these might comprise, and if they are actually suggestive of marine product consumption, remains an open question. So, it's possible they're eating something. Maybe they're eating some sort of preserved fish from marine contexts. I know in other areas, things like parrotfish have shown up, uh, but it's really not clear. But it's an interesting set of values nonetheless. And so, you've heard all about diet now, what I think these individuals might have been doing with their diets and what they were eating, but the question also remains about mobility. And so, Tungul, as the capital of Makuria, quite likely had numerous inhabitants who moved there from elsewhere, as is probably not surprising. Lots of individuals moved to the urban core of places. And so, we used strontium 86 or strontium 87, 86 to approximate which individuals might be local to the site and which might not be local to the area. So this is to say individuals who lived in the area of Dongola during their dental formation. We were using dental enamel for this project, and individuals who may have lived in a different landscape during that time. And I won't get into it, but we didn't really include oxygen here, as there's some ongoing investigation to help refine this, as oxygen doesn't really provide a whole lot of evidence for differentiation across the Nile Valley. This is a broader question, so I won't get into that. So for the point of this, we've just used strontium to look at where individuals may have arrived from, or who may have been local and who may not have been local. And so, as a quick summary, oxygen values get into our body as part of our corporeal being, primarily through what we drink. So we drink a bunch of water, the value from that water gets into our body. A similar premise tracks for strontium, except in this case, it's primarily coming through what we eat. Strontium is leaching up from the bedrock into soils. It's taken up into plants. Those plants are eaten by both us and animals. We eat the plants, as I just said. We also eat the animals. And thus, the values of the environment in which we're doing these things gets integrated into our skeletal tissues. And we're talking about the time of dental formation here because we're not seeing turnover of these tissues. So effectively, we're saying once they're formed, they stay that way. So if you eat apples only from Kitchener-Waterloo when you are 1 year old, and then you move to Vancouver, the signal of those apples in your 1 year old tooth formation will track even into your adulthood because the tissue is not turning over. So we can use this sort of logic to infer this mobility. And so taking this inference and using a local range defined by cattle from the area of Old Dongola, so this is to say we've taken the values from cattle living in the area of Old Dongola, so they were found zooarchaeologically, so at a contemporaneous time, the expected value, the value we would expect for this isotope in the area of Old Dongola, gives us this range, 0.706051 to 0.707196. So the individuals who fall within this range evidently or appear to have evidently lived in the landscape of Old Dongola, and individuals who fall outside of it appear to have moved to Old Dongola from somewhere else. And there's more to this story in the sense of there can be the same values in different regions. And also, we can't say specifically where someone moved from, but nonetheless, we can use this rather binary approach to say in or out. They're in the local range or they're outside of the local range. So with a number of caveats that I won't tell you about in this moment, we can say that a fair number of the individuals here appear to have strontium values that do not suggest they were local from the area. Okay, so we accept that. And here they are. Where might they have come from? This is the broader question, and it runs the risk of getting too far into the story to say, oh, they could have been, from Preston on, their 10th birthday they moved. I'm not going to take it that far, but I would like to suggest 3 possible regions that some of these values track with. So some of these values are quite close to the local range. Again, this introduces the question of the quality of the local range, but let's take it that they fall outside of this local range. So there's 3 regions I'd like to present that are Egypt, Oxumite and post-Oxumite Ethiopia, as well as the Western Sudan and beyond. So these regions have broader sort of potential for interconnectivity with Sudan. This individual, so-called ODB23, has a value that suggests they lived during their dental formation years in a locale that has a much older geology, something maybe granitic in this older area. So for the point of this on the map at the bottom, the areas in pink would be regions in which we might expect to see a value like this. And so as you can see directly across from this sort of, if my mouse works, this sort of brain-shaped area here that is Old Dongola, is the Wadi Hawar that I previously mentioned, that goes all the way out through Kordofan into Darfur and would connect, the route into sort of Kanem-Borno in Chad across the Trans-Sahara. And I'm not saying individuals were coming all the way across. I'm just saying that's the direction you're going if you're going into the Sahara. And so it's quite possible that some individual at Old Dongola was coming into the area from the regions of what are today Kordofan and Darfur. And if I skip back here, in 2019, you can see in this yellow box here, a monastery or a proposed monastery known as Jebel Alain was identified very far out, some over 300 kilometers from the Nile in Kordofan. So this also suggests that more was going on in this region than we currently know. And it also is a region that has not seen a lot of archaeological investigation to date. So there's a lot to be known. We know from other geologically similar areas in the Sahara, so far away, yes, but geologically similar, so the value is helpful to us. In Niger and Libya, we see values that approximate 0.71. So perhaps this individual is coming from somewhere like that. We also have questions about Oxumite, post-Oxumite Ethiopia. So again, in this region, right, with the arrival of Islam spreading through the Arabian Peninsula into Egypt quite quickly, Sudan remains an area of primarily Christian faith into about the 14th century, let's say primarily, and neighboring Ethiopia also similarly remains a Christian locality in this time. And so we know in general, just by dint of location, interactions between these regions were not uncommon, but we also know in the medieval time period that there's several cases of individuals coming into Nubia. So I'd like to suggest that both proximity geographically and proximity socioculturally in being regions that primarily adhere to a Christian faith, there could have been some interaction that saw individuals coming into Sudan. And we know from this map on the right, as one reconstruction, that individuals from Ethiopia would make pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. So there's potential opportunities to move into the area of what is Old Dongola today. And I put Ghazali here as a monastery, also in the region. That could have been a site where, some mobility to these monasteries. There's 2 monasteries at Tungul. So the possibility of individuals coming out of the Ethiopian plateau is not unfathomable. And these 2 individuals suggest childhoods outside the Nile Valley or areas along the Nile, not in the vicinity of Old Dongola. So outside the Nile Valley or not in Old Dongola is to say that they could have come from regions along the Nile, but from aspects or reaches of the Nile that are not in direct proximity to Old Dongola, and thus potentially have a different isotopic value. And for these individuals, the question arises of Egypt. We know that there's a lot of, or quite possibly a lot of interaction between Egypt and Nubia. We know historically, so from the New Kingdom, from the Pharaonic time periods, there's a lot of interaction between this region, but we also know in the medieval time period that there was interactions between these areas, both in terms of influence on the development of monasticism, which has a strong root in Egypt, as well as the potentiality of individuals coming into Nubia after the arrival after the arrival of Islam in Egypt. So with 8th to 9th century Egyptian tax reforms, with increased persecutions in the 11th century, it's quite possible that individuals, be they monks, be they travelers, whatever their background might be, quite possibly could have come in to Nubia. And of course, Old Dongola, as this very large metropolitan type site, would have been quite an interesting locality to reside at. So it's quite possible some individuals might have been coming from areas in Egypt. And so we don't have, I want to stress, concrete evidence that they're definitely coming from Egypt, they're definitely coming out of the Sahara, or they're definitely coming out of Ethiopia, but these proximate regions are logical locales that could have seen individuals moving into what is today Sudan. And so there's still a lot to be done at the site. So thank you for your attention to what I've been saying here, but this is really just a melange of areas that have been covered so far. We would like to continue cemetery excavations in the Christian cemetery at Old Dongola. We'd also like to know more about local water source variation. So this is a larger question about what the expected values in local water might be. This would help with broader mobility assessment. We would also like to look more at questions of diet. Again, this question of fish, other sorts of products. So this is all to say that there's a lot to be done. And of course, I'm telling you about this evening. I am only one individual of a large number of other individuals who've worked on this project. So I'm really grateful to be part of the project, and I look forward to continuing to work on this project. And I thank you all for your attention. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, whatever it might be, I would be glad to hear them. And thank you for your time.